Usually, while it doesn't feel like it, a diet is a luxury. It's a choice you make to look better, feel healthier, or fit into that new suit. It's the American Psycho quote, you can always look better. It implies that you have too much, and you've decided to have a little bit less. Maybe you've been a little bit of a greedy bastard over Christmas. But for the last decade, the people of Venezuela have been on a very different kind of regimen. They call it the Maduro Diet, named, obviously, after their former president, or arguably current president in his words, Nicolas Maduro. He's not, he's in prison. This is a nation sitting on top of the world's largest proven oil reserves, where a survey showed that people lost an average of 11 kilograms in 1 year simply because the supermarkets were empty. Today, we got a story about how one of the wealthiest nations in South America managed to create its own starvation. Alright, so in the mid-2010s, a grim pleasantry started circulating on the streets of Caracas. If you bumped into an old friend that you hadn't seen in a while and they looked noticeably trimmer, as well as having gaunt cheeks and loose clothes and a belt on the last notch, you didn't ask if they had been going to the gym or eating right. Or wrong, that's really skinny. You already knew the answer. They would smile, they would shrug, and they'd say, "Estoy en la dieta de Maduro." I'm sorry about my Spanish there, but it means, I'm on the Maduro diet.
I'll allow it.
By 2016, the Venezuelan government had effectively stopped publishing reliable economic and social statistics. The official narrative was that everything was fine, or at least that any problems were the result of an economic war waged by foreign powers. But that's not what people who weren't the government said. A consortium of the country's top universities launched the Encuesta Nacional de Condiciones de Vida, or INCOVI. They sent researchers into thousands of households to ask the questions the government wouldn't. Are you hungry? How much weight have you lost? The results were pretty damn staggering. In 2016, the survey found that roughly 75% of the population had lost weight unintentionally. On average, those respondents had lost nearly 19 pounds. That's 8.7 kilos in a single year. By the time 2017's data came out, that average had climbed even higher to the 11 kilos or 24 pounds that we mentioned in the intro. This wasn't a famine-stricken region or a marginalized group within the country. This was the national average. Teachers, mechanics, nurses, students. Basically, everybody was shrinking. International outlets like Reuters and America's Quarterly began documenting this phenomenon, noting that the Maduro diet had become a bit of shorthand for a collective, forced starvation. But the data revealed something darker than just scarcity. It suggested a structural collapse so severe that hunger was no longer just a side effect of poverty, it was the defining feature of daily life. So now we have to ask, was this just incompetence? Or did the Maduro diet serve a purpose? Okay, to understand how a country with the largest oil reserves in the world runs out of food, we have to rewind back to the era of Hugo Chavez. For years, Venezuela felt rich, like really rich. Oil prices were high and the Bolivarian revolution was in full swing. The government used that petro-wealth to fund massive social missions, subsidized housing, and, crucially, really cheap food. But there was a fatal flaw in this design. The country became addicted to oil. It accounted for roughly 95% of export earnings. Instead of growing their own food or manufacturing their own goods, why would you? You'd just buy it from abroad with your oil money. I mean, why bother farming corn or milking cows when you can just sell oil and buy shit? By the time Chavez died in 2013, Nicolas Maduro took over. Domestic production had completely withered. And then things got really, really bad. In 2014, global oil prices crashed. Almost overnight, the flow of dollars needed to buy food from the rest of the world just evaporated. The government had established strict currency controls. The state decided who got dollars and at what rate. If you were a friend of the party, you might get cheap dollars to import food, or claim you did. If you were a regular business owner, you were starved of the cash needed to stock shelves. Simultaneously, price controls meant farmers and factories were often forced to sell their goods for less than it cost to make them. And if it costs you $1 to grow a kilo of food, but the government says you can only sell it for 50 cents, well, you don't grow more food, do you? You just stop. When the oil money dried up, the GDP fell off a cliff. Between 2013 and 2019, Venezuela's economy contracted by more than 70%, one of the worst economic collapses in peacetime history. The oil boom was over, and the shelves were about to go bare. So how do you take a fertile country and empty its supermarkets? Well, you just rig the laws of supply and demand, don't you? The mechanism was supposed to help the poor. The government imposed strict price controls on essential goods: milk, rice, cooking oil, and maize flour. Prices were often held below cost and did not keep pace with inflation. But in an economy where inflation was getting absolutely insane, the cost to produce those goods just kept going up. If it costs a dairy farmer 100 bolivars to produce a litre of milk, but the law says he goes to jail if he sells it for more than 50, like we said, he could just stop or go bankrupt or go to prison, I guess, but all of the options suck. Across Venezuela, thousands of producers did just that. They stopped making stuff. To plug the holes, the government took over directly. They expropriated food processing plants, and they put the military in charge of logistics. But soldiers, newsflash, they're not supply chain managers. There are reports of raw ingredients rotting in ports because bribes hadn't been paid, or ghost imports where the government paid for food that never arrived. The government insisted that this was an economic war, claiming that business owners were hoarding goods to sabotage the revolution. But independent studies, including reports from the UN and social science and medicine, pointed to a simpler, colder reality. This wasn't a conspiracy. The shelves were empty because the system had made it impossible to fill them. When the shelves went empty, the people began to get smaller. But because the government refused to publish official health data, we were left in the dark about exactly how bad it was. To find the truth, we have to look at the shadow statistics gathered by that NCOV report. This was a rigorous annual survey conducted by a coalition of universities, interviewing more than 6,000 households when the state effectively stopped counting. The picture they built was terrifying. By 2017, the survey found that roughly 3/4 of the population reported losing weight unintentionally, an average loss of around 11 kilos. That's that average loss of 24 pounds or 11 kilos per person in a year. It meant that 80% of households in a once wealthy nation were now classified as food insecure. If you didn't have access to dollars, you didn't eat. International bodies like the FAO, that's the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, watched on with some degree of concern. Before the crisis, undernourishment in Venezuela was under 5%. By the late 2010s, it had skyrocketed, eventually affecting nearly a third of the population. What these numbers mean is a nation in a state of chronic exhaustion, a workforce too tired to work, students too hungry to study. The Maduro Diet was making the entire country weaker, hollowing the country out from the inside. For millions of Venezuelans, the daily routine stopped revolving around work or school. It revolved around la cola, the line. Survivors describe waking up at 3 or 4 in the morning to walk to the local supermarket. There, they would stand in the dark, marking their spot in a queue that often stretched for blocks, just waiting for the shutters to open. And standing in these lines became a full-time job. You stood there for 6, 8, sometimes 10 hours in the tropical sun, paralyzed by the fear that if you stepped away to use the bathroom, you were going to lose your spot. And the cruelty of the system was that reaching the front didn't really guarantee anything. Often, just as you got to the door, the National Guard would announce that the flour or the rice or whatever could fill your belly was gone. The New York Times reported scenes where soldiers guarded bakeries with rifles, holding back crowds that weren't chanting political slogans. They were chanting, "We are hungry." Families who had grown up eating 3 meals a day began to subtract food. First, you cut out snacks. Then dinner becomes a glass of water. Eventually, parents, mothers especially, began skipping other meals entirely so that their children could eat. In cities like Maracaibo and Valencia, the desperation pushed people out of the lines and into the streets. It became a common sight to see people, professionals, retirees, people who used to take holidays, quietly sifting through commercial garbage bags looking for bruised fruit or discarded vegetable scraps. By 2016, the queues were becoming a bit of a political liability. The government needed a solution that would get people off the streets and ideally keep them loyal. And the answer to that was an acronym: CLAP or CLAP. The local committees for supply and production were launched with a simple promise. The state would bypass the supermarkets and deliver subsidized food boxes directly to your door. For millions of families, this brown cardboard box became the only thing standing between them and total starvation. But there was a catch. The distribution was managed by local committees closely aligned with the ruling party. To receive a box, you generally needed to be registered in a government census, often linked to the Fatherland cards, an ID system that tracks social benefits. Reports from The Washington Post, the US State Department, and Venezuelan NGOs began to describe a disturbing pattern. If you lived in a neighborhood known for protesting, your boxes might arrive late or just not at all. In some cases, civil servants who signed petitions against President Maduro allegedly found themselves struck from the lists. The message was implicit but clear: if you want to eat, you don't bite the hand that feeds you, even if it's not feeding you very much. The boxes themselves were pretty tragic. They were supposed to contain balanced nutrition. Instead, recipients opened them to find low-quality carbohydrates, pasta that dissolved into mush, rice filled with weevils, and powdered milk that turned out to be mostly sodium and sugar. And then there was the money. According to the US Treasury, the CLAP program became a massive engine for alleged corruption. In 2019, the US sanctioned a Colombian businessman named Alex Saab. They accused him of running a network of shell companies that sold this low-quality food to the Venezuelan government at inflated prices, allegedly skimming off hundreds of millions of dollars while the people eating it grew thinner, allegedly. The government denies these charges, calling Saab a diplomat and a hero. But for the family opening a box of gritty rice 3 weeks later, the geopolitics didn't really matter very much. What mattered was that their hunger had been bureaucratized, monetized, and turned into a lever of control. Again, allegedly. If the Maduro Diet was a bit of a joke for adults, for children, it wasn't even close to a joke. While adults can lose weight and recover, a child's body just works differently. When a child stops eating, they stop developing. For years, the Venezuelan government maintained a data blackout, refusing to release infant mortality or nutrition statistics. So, humanitarian groups like Caritas had to go into the poorest neighborhoods to find out what was really happening. They set up sentinel sites to weigh and measure children. What they found was an emergency. To understand the data, you really need to understand a couple of terrifying medical terms: wasting and stunting. Wasting is acute. It's when a child's weight drops dangerously low for their height. It is the immediate phase of starvation. Stunting, that's chronic. It happens when a child has been malnourished for so long that their body simply stops growing. This causes lifetime developmental problems. By 2019, Caritas analyzed over 46,000 records from these vulnerable areas. They found that nearly 32% of the children were stunted. In terms of acute malnutrition, wasting, the rates had crossed the World Health Organization's emergency threshold of 10% and just kept on climbing. Doctors, often working without basic supplies like running water or electricity, reported seeing the clinical signs of severe protein deficiency, swollen bellies, discoloration of the skin, conditions usually associated with famine zones. Doctors described mothers fainting in wards because they hadn't eaten in days, having given every scrap of food that they could scavenge to their children. The scariest part is that this damage doesn't end when the food comes back. Stunting in the first 1,000 days of life often causes irreversible cognitive and physical damage. A generation of Venezuelan children suffered lifetime consequences because of this. Whenever the subject of Venezuelan hunger comes up, the conversation almost immediately hits a wall of blame. Ask the Venezuelan government why the shelves are empty, and they will point north. For years, President Maduro insisted that his country is the victim of a US-led economic war, arguing that Washington's sanctions have blockaded the country and strangled its ability to feed its people. And he wasn't entirely wrong with this, but the timeline does tell a more complicated story. To get to the truth, we have to look at the calendar. The economic collapse, the empty shelves, and the beginning of the Maduro Diet all kicked in around 2014, following the oil price crash and years of rigid currency controls. The first major US financial sanctions, the ones that restricted the government's ability to borrow money, they didn't hit until late 2017. The sweeping sanctions on the state oil company, PDVSA, they didn't arrive until 2019. By that point, the GDP had already cratered and hyperinflation was already rampant. Was going bad way before the US got involved. However, denying that sanctions played a role later, that's also dishonest. Even though food and medicine are technically exempt from US sanctions, the reality of international banking is pretty messy. This is a phenomenon called overcompliance. Global banks, terrified of accidentally violating US law and getting fined billions, often refuse to process any transaction involving the Venezuelan government. The UN Special Rapporteur on Unilateral Coercive Measures, Alina Duan, has argued that these sanctions have had a devastating effect, compounding the misery of an already broken system. So, is it the sanctions, or is it the socialism? The consensus among most independent economists and the UN Human Rights Office is that the crisis was born from domestic policy and corruption. The sanctions came later, acting as an accelerant on a fire the government had already lit. Yet amidst this debate, the official line remained one of denial. On the floor of the United Nations, Venezuelan officials frequently claimed the humanitarian crisis was a fabrication by the media. The ultimate verdict on the Maduro Diet, though, that was delivered on the highways, the bridges, and the mountain passes leading out of the country. When a government breaks the social contract so completely that it cannot feed its citizens, the people eventually stop waiting for a solution. They just leave. By 2024, the UN's R4V platform, a coordination body tracking the crisis, estimated that more than 7.7 million Venezuelans have fled the country. To put that in perspective, that is roughly 20% of the entire pre-crisis population. It is as if the entire population of Switzerland or the state of Washington simply packed their bags and left. For millions, hunger was the primary push factor. There are testimonies from families who sold their refrigerators and wedding rings just to buy tickets to the Colombian border. When the money ran out, they walked, sometimes for weeks, through the freezing Andes Mountains, on bodies that were already depleted by years of malnutrition. Migrants arriving in Bogota often described the Maduro Diet not as a joke, but as the final straw. They showed aid workers belts punched by hand and photos of what they looked like 5 years ago. But crossing the border didn't always mean leaving the hunger behind. Studies of Venezuelan migrants in Colombia found that while food was available, it was often unaffordable for refugees working in formal jobs. They had traded a country with no food for a country where they couldn't afford the food that was right in front of them. This mass exodus created one of the largest displacement crises in the world, often rivaling Syria. So as millions fled across the borders, the international community began to change the way it talked about Venezuela. You see, for a long time, the crisis was framed as an economic disaster, a case of bad management. But by 2018, human rights groups were using a darker and more specific term, a complex humanitarian emergency. That's a label used when a disaster is caused primarily by political authority and conflict rather than a hurricane or an earthquake. Organizations like the FIDH, the International Federation for Human Rights, and the Venezuelan NGO Provea published a report with a chilling title, "Food is Not a Game." They documented how the machinery of the state, specifically programs like CLAP, was allegedly being weaponized. The charge was that food was being systematically withheld from those who opposed the government. The Organization of American States, OAS, and UN bodies received testimony that people were threatened with being cut off from food boxes if they didn't vote the right way or if they signed petitions criticizing President Maduro. Scholars, like those of the Royal Society of Canada, argued that this went beyond discrimination. They called it state-induced hunger, a deliberate decision to let people starve to maintain power. This argument has now reached the highest court in the world. Submissions to the International Criminal Court, the ICC, in The Hague, have argued that these actions could constitute crimes against humanity. The logic is that severely depriving a population of fundamental rights, like the right to eat, in order to persecute them politically falls under Article 7 of the Rome Statute. And look, these remain allegations. But the mere fact that prosecutors are examining Venezuela's food situation as potential evidence of crimes against humanity shows just how far the Maduro Diet drifted from a bad economic joke into a potential atrocity. So around 2019, something strange started happening in Caracas. For years, walking into a supermarket meant facing rows of empty metal racks. Suddenly, though, almost overnight, the shelves were full. The government, facing total collapse, had quietly given up on its rigid controls. They stopped arresting shopkeepers for setting their own prices, and crucially, they looked the other way as the US dollar replaced the worthless bolivar. It looked like a recovery, but really the Maduro Diet, it hadn't ended. You see, this is the era of the dollar diet. Today, you can find almost anything you want in Venezuela if you have greenbacks. Private luxury import stores popped up everywhere, selling goods at international prices. But here's the catch. Most public sector workers, teachers, and pensioners are still paid in bolivars or earn wages that haven't caught up to this new reality. A nurse might earn the equivalent of $10 to $20 a month. A jar of imported peanut butter might cost $8. So the crisis shifts from scarcity to exclusion. The food is there, right behind the glass, but for millions, it might as well be on the moon. The World Food Programme's 2023 report paints a stark picture of this inequality. Despite the full shelves in the wealthy districts, they estimated that 5.2 million people still needed humanitarian assistance. Specifically, around 2.5 million Venezuelans were still in need of direct food and nutrition support. The hunger became invisible to those with dollars. The lines outside supermarkets vanished, not because everyone was fed, but because the people who couldn't pay simply stopped showing up. Now we need to go back to those brown cardboard boxes, because while millions of Venezuelans were opening them to find expiring milk and insect-ridden rice, investigators around the world were discovering that the CLAP program was a multi-million-dollar crime scene. The trail started in Mexico. They found that these companies were allegedly buying low-quality bulk food at rock-bottom prices, then reselling it to the Venezuelan government at massive markups. The difference in price, the profit, didn't go to buy more food. It allegedly vanished into a network of shell companies. In 2019, the US Treasury Department sanctioned Colombian businessman, that chap from before, Alex Saab. They accused him of being the architect of the scheme. The Treasury's press release was blunt. It alleged that Saab and his associates had looted hundreds of millions of dollars from these food contracts. And the accusations went right to the top. The US government alleged that kickbacks from these inflated contracts were being paid to stepsons of President Maduro himself. There were even reports from Colombia of authorities seizing shipments of CLAP boxes that were filled with rotting food unfit for human consumption, destined for Venezuelan tables. And it's important to state that Alex Saab and the Venezuelan government have vehemently denied these charges. They are just allegations. So, is the Maduro diet over? Well, Maduro is, but what about the diet bit? According to the World Food Programme's reporting from 2023 and 2024, nearly 5.2 million Venezuelans were still in need of humanitarian assistance. While the lines outside supermarkets have largely disappeared, they have been replaced by a quiet, grinding inability to pay. Independent surveys like Encovi show that while extreme poverty has dipped slightly, mostly thanks to those who have access to dollars or remittances from relatives abroad, food insecurity remains stubbornly high. In 2021, the World Food Programme was finally allowed to launch a school feeding program in the country, an admission by the state that it could not feed its own children. But even this lifeline's fragile, subject to funding cuts and logistical hurdles. While the country has pulled back from the absolute abyss of 2017, undernourishment rates remain significantly higher than they were before the crisis began. The Maduro diet has left a permanent scar. A generation has grown up smaller, hungrier, and more unequal than their parents. The emergency phase might be fading from the headlines, but for millions of families, the hunger just hasn't ended. In the end, the Maduro diet serves as a devastating warning label for the rest of the world. It reminds us that hunger in the modern age is rarely an accident of nature. Venezuela has fertile lands, it has water, it sits on endless energy reserves. The starvation that hollowed out a generation wasn't caused by a drought or by a plague, it was engineered. First by accident, through catastrophic economic mismanagement and addiction to oil, and then, according to human rights investigators, by design. We saw how a state can create dependency, destroying independent farms and businesses until the government is the only grocer left in town. We saw how once that monopoly is established, the grocery list can become impossible if you dissent. And we saw how if you dissent, you don't eat. Today, the term is fading from daily conversation, replaced by the hustle of the dollar economy, but the scar remains. The Maduro diet began as a dark joke, a way to laugh at the absurdity of losing weight while living in a rich country. But it ended as a crime scene. Thank you for watching.